Good morning, friends of the World War II Memorial. I'm becoming one of the friends here. I'm in Colorado Springs with what I believe is a very serious and worthwhile addition to the history of the Pacific War. And that's the memoir that my father wrote right after World War II, after being released from a Japanese prison camp in Mukden, Manchuria. And 2010, just the local museum here in Colorado Springs, the Pioneers Museum, launched a very aggressive and interesting exhibit on the POWs during World War II. And the entire Japanese half of that was my father's archive. The other half was a splendid edition of the Stalag 13, where Steve McQueen did not ride his motorcycle over a fence. But the Pioneers Museum exhibition is what launched this project to get the book. Because when my family and I aggregated all our father's archive, which is immense, we were then able to put together a strong story on his entire experience. To begin with, Dad was a senior staff officer of General Jonathan Wainwright in the Philippines during the fall of the Philippines. And he was G4, Wainwright's logistic officer, which put him in a place where he was very able to observe and to record everything that was going on during the fall of Bataan and Corregidor itself. And he was an inveterate writer, my father was, and so his ability to record all of this in a stack of diaries that he was able to keep both during the fall of the Philippines and 3.5 years as a Japanese prisoner. His ability to retain and maintain a stack of 15 diaries, which look all like school kid tablets to me. I'm very proud of his story and the diaries that he assembled. I'm offering to anybody out there, researchers, historians, electronically, either from the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, or myself. And they are extensive. So if you want to look at diaries that are the most authoritative and most extensive of all the American diaries that were written during this time, in my view, and that has to do with my father's access as G4 staff officer and his penchant for writing. There are many diaries printed, and I can name them. I have them all myself, and they're all useful and good, but they're mostly chronological, and that's fine. Part of my diary, my father's diaries, were chronological too. But my dad went deeper into the study of POWs and their behavior during a 3.5-year POW experience. Primary thing that he did was record the fall of Corregidor, where he did not do the Bataan Death March. Most of the Americans did go on the Bataan Death March, but when Bataan fell, the staff, Wainwright himself, and the Angels of Bataan the nurses all went over to Corregidor to sit out another month's siege, which was pretty terrible. As the logistic officer of Wainwright's, he was participating in the rescue of the Angels of Bataan himself, responsible for getting them over to the island. And that was one of his proud moments that he didn't know it at the time, but he did that. Then the diaries are key to the whole archival collection that we have. I've included a sample of his writing, which is cursive. He had very tight cursive writing in this entire stack of diaries. Now, when Wainwright realized that Corregidor had to surrender after a month's siege, he attempted to approach the Japanese commander, General Homa, who would not take a surrender because Homa, being an astute general, did not want a guerrilla war on his backside. So General Homa was insisting on Wainwright's gathering the remaining commanders in the field, thought to be still there, both down south in Mindanao and in Luzon. And the pictures here we have of General Wainwright together with General Beebe, his G4 before Dad took over, and then Tom Dooley. We can identify those gentlemen, and then the Japanese put together their own propaganda piece, as you can see. So Homa would not accept the surrender, and the story goes that, well, General Wainwright said, well, what do I do? And Homa said, I don't care what you do. And here we are with the Corregidor being invaded by Japanese with flame-throwing tanks aiming at Malinta Tunnel, which is a picture, some pictures here of the surrender. And so Wainwright was simply flabbergasted. He didn't know what to do because he knew that the 14,000 remaining Americans and Filipinos were going to get slaughtered. So what he had to do was get permission to send officers into the field to find who the commanders thought to be there. There were 3 officers he sent, 2 to northern Luzon, one of which was my father. When we see the map here, you can see the huge mountain range up there in northern Luzon, the boondocks that my father had to spend 6 weeks in a trek up there with a Japanese escort and the 2 flags that are kind of essential to the story. Now, the Japanese had given my father those 2 dime store flags to help cross whatever lines he was going to cross in this 6-week trek, because nobody knew quite where battle lines were. So he had those 2 flags, and he also had a white flag at the time to wave, and I don't really know how effective they were, but they are an essential part of my father's story. So after 6 weeks, Dad came back and rejoined now the POWs who had been regarded by the Japanese not as POWs, but as captives. Now this was important because captivehood did not help under international law the treatment of captives and POWs. But once the surrender was accomplished, then officially the Americans became POWs. The group that Dad joined with Wainwright were the senior officers. And I can name them, but right now we don't need to name them all. General Lewis Beebe, General King, Ed King, who had surrendered Bataan, and eventually the British commander, and then the Percival, and also the Dutch commander from the Dutch East Indies were joining this group of high-ranking officers that were now going to be together during the war in the various prison camps. Now, the map of the broad Pacific, where the prison camps beginning in Takeo, the Philippines, and then into Taiwan for most of the time, from 1942 to 1945. This group of prisoners, as you can see, from the Philippines up to Taiwan, and the 2 prison camps, one was Karenko and the other was Shirakawa. And then as the perimeter of the war kept going west, the Japanese would move this group of prisoners up and away from the perimeter as far as best they could for obvious reasons. Now, the Japanese did not treat this senior group of officers all that swell. One of the common themes in the diaries are getting bopped by a young, 17-year-old Taiwanese or Japanese private during this 3.5 years. So they ended up going up through Japan over to eventually in August of 45 the Camp Houghton prison camp in Mukden, Manchuria. Now the Manchurian experience was where the end of his experience and together with the other prisoners was. And one of the astounding parts of Dad's story is the rescue release in August of 1945. The two bombs had gone off, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hirohito went on the air to surrender, the first time he was ever on Japanese radio. And the Russian Red Army was about to enter the Pacific War. Now, here's a chronology that's almost hour by hour, but it's quite fascinating. When the Japanese surrendered, the American area commander in Chongqing, China, was afraid what Japanese POW commanders might do. So he initiated what is called Cardinal Mission, which was a group of 6 OSS individuals, including one fellow by the name of Hal Leith. Now, Hal Leith was a sergeant who was fluent in Russian and Chinese. You hate a guy like that when he's 25 years old. But Hal Leith was a vital part of Dad's story and that of the other POWs. The OSS team, 6 of them, jumped out of a B-24 right near the Camp Houghton, almost on top of a Japanese patrol. Now, this was a pretty hairy moment. They were only given sidearms. They were not there to fight anybody. They were there only to hopefully persuade the Japanese commander, Colonel Matsuda in this case, to simply understand that the war had been declared over by the emperor. And Matsuda was not aware of that. So here was a very tense moment where nobody quite knew what was going to happen, but somehow the OSS team was able to talk the Matsuda commander on the camp that, the war is over. There's no more point in fighting. We're here not to fight. We're only here to convey a message. They had no authority, this OSS team, other than simply a messenger team. Now, curiously, 3 days later, the Russian Red Army showed up in Manchuria. And here, and particularly showing up in Camp Houghton. And so here's a 3-day chronology that's quite interesting. The OSS team, again, had no authority to demand anything, surrender or whatnot. Only the Red Army had authority as a participant in the war to accomplish a formal surrender of this prison camp. And they did, and the minute-by-minute chronology, both in Hal Leith's diaries and my father's diaries, was quite astounding. The Hal Leith, the guy, which I met 13 years ago, curiously, to jump ahead a little bit, here in Golden, Colorado. And I'm in Colorado Springs, and when I learned of Hal Leith's name up there, I was on the road real quick to go up and meet Hal Leith. And we had a wonderful relationship for a couple years. He's now gone, but I do have a picture here of him and myself at the Pioneer Museum exhibition. The surrender was by the Russians, and only that, and one of Dad's proudest moments was when the Russians took the arms from the camp soldiers, guards, and handed them to the Americans, declaring, "You are now free. The Americans just kind of stood there in awe. They did not make a move of retribution. They did not make a move to hurt anybody. And that was one of my father's proudest moments, I think, was when he and his fellow Americans behaved that way. But here, one of the fun stories, if there's any fun story in my dad's story, it's this one. In Mukden, Manchuria, the Yamato Hotel was the hotel over the years that Mukden was famous for. Now, after the release and after everything was calmed down, the Russian field marshal, a 31-year-old Russian Red Army field guy, think of the blue pants with the red stripe coming down, had a banquet held a banquet at the Yamato Hotel with some of his staff and Dad and some of his officer companions. Now imagine these guys, 3.5 years in semi-starvation, being presented with a table full of every conceivable food and liquor you could imagine. It was a true feast. And in good Russian style, the Russians were insistent on filling glasses full of liquor and holding them up to the lips of the Americans. And that's how the Russians like to party. They'll hold that glass and tip it right up into your lips, making you drink it almost. Now, Dad was a pretty proud bourbon drinker, but after 3.5 years, he knew he was going to get in big trouble here. And so he was careful to look at the table and find oil, sardines, and swallow as much oil as he could find on that table, trying to signal his associates, his Americans, to do the same thing. And anyway, there was a good afternoon of banqueting and good times, but then there was a rainy day, a miserable day. And when the dark came, they were going to break up, and the Americans were going to then drive in a Russian Jeep over, a couple miles over to Camp Houghton, the barracks there. But during that drive back from the banquet, they were followed by a pair of headlights all the way, dogtailing them. And that, as we all know, can be pretty annoying when somebody is tailgating you that way. But when they finally got into the rain-soaked camp and got out, the other car drove up alongside, and it was a Jeep with the Russian field marshal in it, with one of his staffers. And they just wanted to make sure that the POWs got back safely. And that, to me, is the one fun story of my dad's experience. Now, when I mentioned Hal Leith, that's a guy, he had a Kodak in his jeans, and he took these pictures. And I was able to get Hal's family to give me permission to use these pictures. But these pictures are interesting. Some of them are Japanese taking. And if they have swords in their hand, as some of these do, they haven't yet surrendered. So only these swords were gone after the official surrender. And the Americans, including my father, were able to bring back samples of what we used to call samurai swords. If one thing describes my father's personality, it's his sense of personal dignity. And that was true during the war. When I was a young child, didn't remember him then, but when he got back home after the war, my experience with my dad was they maintained his personal dignity regardless of the circumstances. And when his fellow officers behaved in an undignified manner, which was often enough, my dad would hold his tongue, but he would write down, okay, here's somebody that did something stupid, rushing for the rice bowl out of turn, that kind of thing. And the book itself is what I believe presents the story of American POWs, senior officers now, college educated, behaving the way they did. Now, one reason was that the Japanese refused to recognize any kind of hierarchy among the American POWs. No ranks were allowed to be recognized, and everybody kind of like I call it a MASH episode, were simply there as sole survivors, surviving as best they could. But the book itself, it will give you an extensive chronology and philosophical almost description of Americans behind bars and how they behave and how they should have behaved. And it's important to know that I guess I've said this, the Japanese did not treat this group of prisoners as bad as they did other prison camps, particularly in Japan proper, where starvation and bayoneting and all the horrible things we are aware of went on. This group, maybe for political reasons, was at least kept alive. And one of the pictures of his post-release in 1945 shows a rank of 6 or 7 officers together with my father, who are looking pretty healthy, frankly. But they had had a few days, I think a week or so of food, and they were able to fatten up a bit, but they at least were able to be kept alive, and that was obviously pretty important. I would be happy to take your questions now. Let's have a good conversation.